those out?
I think I can pass them out, and you don't need to fill them out, but if you have a couple minutes and you feel like doing it, you can. Let's see. I guess what I'll do is, let's do this. Let me do this. Let's go vertically instead of horizontally. So you can go that way.
PowerPoint remote. The only two buttons you need are the right arrow is forward, left arrow is backward.
Got it.
Don't mess with the middle.
Okay.
All right.
There you go.
Why, thank you.
Sure. Yeah. If you guys, if they should be some coming back there. If they don't come back, let me know and I'll bring them. Can we just go sort of up the back there? Just
So
go
you
up
can get
that way?
started and all.
I think we're probably pretty good, but thanks. All right, do you guys get them?
No,
There we go. Yeah, I think we're good. Sure. I am, yeah.
I enjoy teaching.
Oh, good, I'm glad. Thank you. I think they're basically handed out. Yeah, well, we're videotaping. Hey, guys. We're going to get started. We're passing out a one-page... Hello. The tables have turned. You guys have told me to be quiet for so many years as teachers, and now I get to turn the tables. So there's a one-page stress mindset scale that is making the ways around. If you have a couple minutes to quickly fill it out, you can. If not, there will be a moment during the talk where we can do it, or you can do it later. I would find it ironic if a stress mindset scale enhanced stress, so we're going to try to avoid that. If you don't have one, raise your hand and let me know, and we'll make sure you get one. Okay, good. Thanks. All right, so we're going to talk today. This is, I'm really excited to be here. So my name is John Hallway. I am a guy who's lost his clicker. I'm a Shipley parent. Some of you may know my daughter Maggie. She's a senior here. She's been here since 9th grade. I am officially in all of your debt because the growth that she has displayed in her 4 years here make very clear to me that this was the right place for her, that she was surrounded by people who cared for her, that gave her a tremendous amount of thought. And I have to say, I was sitting in one of the non-prize winning seats over here during this morning's first presentation, and I had never actually seen I'm kind of a Star Wars fan. I'd never seen the fully amassed power of this fully functional battle station before, right? Like having all of you guys in the room and seeing just how many people it takes to run the programs that you run was really kind of inspiring and impressive. So I just want to start by saying thank you for what you do and thank you for what you have done. Maggie got in early to Tulane University, and so that's a win, man, right? Maggie's a win. So thanks for that. The reason that I'm here is not for that purpose. I'm here because I took the MAP program last year and have been working, I work at Penn Law in my day job, and I've been working at the law school to integrate the well-being stuff that we've learned there. At the law school, I run a criminal justice reform center, and we specialize in helping different parts of the criminal justice system come together to review cases of error, wrongful convictions, officer-involved shootings, things like that. And I started asking questions about how to make diverse groups of people with political reasons not to get along come together to solve complex problems. And then I realized that I had teenagers and the problems they were having, and then I realized that I'm a lawyer, and lawyers are pessimistic and skeptical, and the loneliest profession, and suicide and substance abuse are rampant in our society. And somewhere in there, I began to think that maybe well-being would be useful in, I don't know, all of those areas. So I went back and got the master's degree, and one of the things that came out of that is the talk that I'm about to give to you, which somebody must think is okay because I gave it to the seed class and the students didn't throw up all over it, and so they decided that you guys would be my next audience. So that's kind of the who I am and how I got here. And what we're going to talk about today is kind of a positive reframing of stress, a new way of thinking about stress that has been shown by the science to actually have physiological benefits, health benefits, as well as emotional benefits. This works best and is the most fun if you guys interrupt and raise your hands and ask questions. That way we make sure that we get areas that are important to you. So I would encourage you to do so. And we'll have some interactive stuff in it as well. Okay, so you guys already know this, but well-being is a multifaceted thing. What exactly the facets are vary based on frameworks. This is actually Penn's. So Penn has a website for students and faculty and staff. The ABA does one for lawyers. They take sexual out because they're talking about jobs. But if you're a high school student or a college student, sexual is probably pretty important. If you're talking about engagement in the workplace, we're probably just going to call that social. But the idea is that there are these different elements of our lives, these different aspects of our lives, and well-being really encompasses all of them, right? It's hard to be really well in your mind when, maybe your job's going really well, but your marriage is in the tank, or the marriage and the job are going well, but your mother is declining in her health. And all of those things come together into well-being, and being conscious of the different areas of our lives and how they affect each other is kind of what we're talking about. One of the challenges that we have at the university is there tends to be a focus really on well-being as code for suicide prevention, right? And so one of the things that the positive psychology is useful for is to say to people, actually, instead of thinking about well-being as a binary 0 or 1, let's think about it on a spectrum. And so I like the -10 to 10, with most of us hanging out kind of in the middle, right? Most of us are somewhere in the -2 to 4 range, let's say, in most days of our lives, somewhere between crisis mode and everything is awesome, right? And so the idea is not to ignore the crisis people, right? The people who are in crisis, we definitely need to help. We need to get those people out of crisis mode and into an area where they can focus. But really what we're going to talk about today is not for the people who are in crisis mode, but instead how to move everybody in that sort of normal range farther to the right, how to help them build skills and kind of a preventative armor, because inevitably stress is going to be part of our lives. Inevitably, we're going to get curveballs and negative things that happen to us. And the question is, how do we build up the strength and the tolerance so that when that happens, instead of going from a 0 to a -7, right, we go from a 2 or a 3 to a -2, someplace where it's easier for us to recover, build back. Stress is a big part of the thing that's going to weaken us. And so understanding how to handle that stress becomes an important thing as far as building that preventative armor. Now, when I have talked to teachers in the past, this is an important metaphor, right? Who knows what this metaphor is? Right? This is first give the mask to yourself before you turn and give it to the child, because if you can't breathe, you're no good to anybody, right? Educators tend to take this talk and say, I know exactly how I'm going to apply this to my students. That's terrific, but don't forget the middle step, right? You guys are stressed too. And the same skills that we're teaching the students we should use to apply to ourselves, both because it makes our teaching better, right? Because if we're using it, we're more compelling advocates, but also because we need it. And it's important to have that self-care element here. So I appreciate how self-sacrificing you are. I appreciate how generous you are. But take a moment with this talk and think about its application to you, as well as its application to the students that you guys take care of. Okay, so what is stress, right? So historically, stress is a threat in our environment that demands our focus, right? And there's a negative bias associated with it for obvious reasons, right? If I fail to pay attention to this wolf, the downside is a lot different than if I fail to pay attention to a rainbow. Okay? So our bodies sort of evolutionarily are geared to the negative aspects of stress and focusing on threats in our environment. And, the wolf is sort of, hopefully for most of us, not a normal occurrence, but studying for a test or something like that might be. Wow, this really is fast. Well-being exists on a spectrum from slide 1 to slide 19. Okay, so everybody in this picture is stressed, right? Christine Ford is stressed because she's going to go say something that's very difficult in an area where lots of people are going to have very strong opinions about what she does. Her lawyers are stressed because they care for her. They've practiced and trained her for this moment, prepared her for it, but they still don't know how it's going to go, and that's important to them. But what's also interesting about this is that when we showed this, we put these hearings on big TVs in the law school because it's obviously a topic of intense interest to our students. And we had students come in and say, could you please turn this off? This is too much for me. right? And so part of the reason for having this here is that stress happens directly to us, but it's also indirect in our environment. And we react to things. My son, when he was younger, would get very concerned about nuclear war. Not because it was a real precise thing for him, but because it was something that he couldn't control that was out there in his environment, and it made him nervous. And so all of those things are stressful, and not all of them are things that we can actively do anything about, right? And that can be it can feel kind of soul-crushing, okay? So all of these things are aspects of stress, and our bodies respond, right? And in fact, I'm having a lot of these responses right now because one of the things I'm doing right now is a very stressful thing, which is public speaking. And even though I'm a pretty experienced public speaker, I still get the hormonal reactions when I stand up to do this. I also usually feel like I have to pee, but that seems to have passed. Whew. But we get these hormonal responses, right? Our heart rate goes up, our blood pressure goes up. We focus on the thing that's stressful. That's the cortisol, the increasing our glucose and reducing sort of non-essential systems. One of the things that we find in criminal justice is eyewitnesses, when there's a weapon present, generally focus right in on the weapon. And so an eyewitness identification is less likely to be accurate in a case where there's a weapon present, not because the person, isn't a great observer of things, but because the stress draws them to focus on that one thing to the exclusion of other things. And so our cognitive abilities actually reduce when we're under stress because we're focused on the thing that is causing us the stress, which draws our attention to it through these physiological mechanisms. Ah, come on. Okay. All right. Yeah, exactly. But I want to challenge the underlying assumption of stress being a soul-crushing thing. Because if you think about all the things that stress you out, you will find that they have one thing in common. And that is the thing that stresses you out is something that is important to you. Now, when I give the wolf example, what's important to you is survival, and the stakes are pretty high, right? But when I'm talking about teaching a class, what's important to you is you want to convey knowledge to these students and help them learn and grow, right? That's important to you because it's your job, your calling, it's the way you've chosen to spend your time, and you care about the students and their reactions, right? So viewed in that context, stress is no longer a focus on something negative. It's actually there to draw your attention to something that you care about so that your outcome is better. Right? That is why you are stressed. You are stressed because something important to you needs your attention in order for it to result the way you want it to result. And that means that stress is here to help you. Okay? Stress is an opportunity for us to rise to the occasion and secure an outcome that we want. Now, I was delighted when Steve talked about the volleyball team because Maggie was on that team and because the parents and the students in that away gym were really kind of jerks. And it was awesome to jam it up their noses that we won in their house. I've heard that the coach is a nice guy as long as he's winning. In any event, the point is, we can't do away with stress in our lives, and in fact, we don't want to, because the absence of stress means that we're totally apathetic about things, and that's not a great way to be, right? We're gonna have stress as long as there are things we care about, but if we realize that what the stress is doing is it's sending us a signal that we need to pay attention to those things, it actually changes the way our body responds to stress.
Can changing how you think about stress make you healthier? And here the science says yes. When you change your mind about stress, you can change your body's response to stress. Now, in a typical stress response, your heart rate goes up and your blood vessels constrict like this. And this is one of the reasons that chronic stress is sometimes associated with cardiovascular disease. It's not really healthy to be in this state all the time. But in the study, when participants viewed their stress response as helpful, their blood vessels stayed relaxed like this. Their heart was still pounding, but this is a much healthier cardiovascular profile. It actually looks a lot like what happens in moments of joy and courage. Over a lifetime of stressful experiences, this one biological change could be the difference between a stress-induced heart attack at age 50 and living well into your 90s. And this is really what the new science of stress reveals, that how you think about stress matters. The next time your heart is pounding from stress, you're going to remember this talk, and you're going to think to yourself, this is my body helping me rise to this challenge. And when you view stress in that way, your body believes you, and your stress response becomes healthier.
So what I would have said, had the clicker not advanced me to this as it did, was that this is Kelly Mcgonigal, who's a Stanford researcher who has researched stress deeply. And in fact, she has a book called The Upside of Stress that led to this talk and this TED Talk that I would commend to you. The other thing that I would say is that, the purpose of a TED Talk is to have the one little change that helps you live for 40 years. And it's not clear to me that this one change is really going to be the difference between you dying at 55 and you living to 90. I think there are probably some other factors that contribute to that as well. But it doesn't change the underlying point that how we think about stress actually has a reaction, a physiological reaction to the hormones, the generation of those hormones, and what it does for us. And so, that's what the stress mindset scale that I've sent you guys is meant to articulate and help you understand about yourselves. So this is a study that was done by a researcher named Alia Crum, also at Stanford. And what she did was she took 3 groups of college students. And one group got to see 3 15-minute videos interspersed over the course of a week. So they watched each video once, 15 minutes at a time, 3 videos over a week. That's the full intervention. Okay? The enhancing group got to see 3 videos that were about pressure is a privilege, stress is an opportunity to rise to the challenge, positive, uplifting messages about stressful situations. The control group got to watch episodes of like Columbo or something. And the debilitating group got, oh my God, this is awful, like stress debilitating, soul crushing sorts of things. And what we see is that the stress mindset lines from the enhancing folks, which is the blue lines, did exactly what we would hope they would do. Everybody's view of stress got more positive, as a result of which they exhibited fewer health symptoms, right? So the upper right line going down is what we want to see because these people are exhibiting fewer symptoms of poor health. And on both soft and hard metrics of work performance, their performance went up in the study period of several weeks after this. So with fairly light interventions, we see positive things happening as far as the perception of stress and its results and outcomes. Similarly, with the debilitating group, we see that as your mindset goes down, your symptoms of health that are reported are much higher, and your work performance is static or a little lower, right? So just by changing the stress mindset, we see enhancements in all of those areas, and that's all a good thing. Now, how do we measure and know where our stress mindset is? We have the questionnaire that you guys have in front of you. If you've had time to look at it, that's great. This is not a test. There is no right or wrong answer. But just so that you interpret it when you've given it to yourself, if you have a 1 to 10 score, that is generally viewed as having a negative approach to stress. So you tend to view stress in that context more on the soul-crushing, intimidating, upsetting side. If you are in the 11 to 20 side of things, God, it seems to be really only little things. The moderate mindset, and a 21 to 32 means you're already sort of inclined to think about stress as a positive. Now, if you're in the 1 to 10 area, are you going to have a heart attack at 55? Maybe. I don't know, but not necessarily because of this. What it means is not that you're doomed. The whole point of this is that your mindset is dynamic and changeable with intentionality and thought. What this means is there's an opportunity here for you to remind yourself more regularly that stress as a positive is going to help you approach that situation and get better outcomes out of it, right? If you're already in that positive mindset, that's great. It's still useful to keep in mind, but don't think that you're doing it wrong if you are in the 1 to 10 arena. Think about the things, the intentionality of, when I feel something stressful, what am I going to do about that? How can I change that situation? So let's take a second. Let's take like 2 minutes, and I'd like each of you guys to turn to whoever's next to you or behind you, do groups of 2 or 3. Talk about things that stress you out in your day-to-day lives. This, maybe not the moment to get into really, really dark stuff, but like things that stress you out in your day-to-day lives for a couple of minutes. And then when you've talked about it to your colleague, have them say something back to you about how to reposition that as a positive. And then let's see what comes out.
pulled out of that. Let me see if there's another clicker. Pushing the button a little less. I know. You're doing a good job. Also, I admire your APA references.
They're not formatted correctly. They're just...
Don't think some of those italics and parentheses didn't jump right out. You did.
If you haven't changed roles, make sure other people are speaking too. All right, we'll go for about 30 seconds more. Okay, let's wrap up the conversations. And we're coming back now. Yes, I do need my xylophone. Okay, so can I get a couple of volunteers who are willing to talk about the stress that they have on a sort of a daily basis and a useful reframing? Sure.
I was interested because our group was talking about cognitive dissonance and how that connects to stress, and I'd just be interested in what you have to say about that.
Okay, so I'm not going to do what you wanted, John. So tell me, so cognitive dissonance, tell me what you mean when you're using that phrase.
That what is and what appears to be are not reconciled, that you're living two different realities at the same time that don't match.
So what I'm hearing when you say that is I'm hearing there are dialogues going on in my mind that may or may not reflect a reality, and I'm reacting to those dialogues in ways that enhance my stress reaction. Is that a fair characterization of what you're saying?
I didn't understand what you said.
Well, So we seem to be on the same page there, at least. So when you say cognitive dissonance, what I hear is, like, when Maggie says to me, I said something stupid in class and now everybody thinks I'm a moron. Right? There's a cognitive dissonance there in that not everybody thinks that she's a moron, but she has that reaction to an inner voice that's going on as a result that results from a stressful thing. I'm not sure if that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, no, I was talking more about things not matching up, so that that there's a narrative that's stated in say on campus, but that doesn't necessarily match up to the reality that people experience.
Can you give me an example? Yep.
So how do I match up? I'm in a really positive environment with things happening that don't make me feel very positive.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, just because it was part of our same conversation, just to get into it, I think what we were sort of talking about was just cognitive dissonance, and it's after that in this case, where in any institution, and certainly here, there's just because of the nature of the institution and through PR of that institution, there's a lot of ideals out there that we're expected to operate on, but I think every teacher anyway, well, not every, I can't speak for everyone, they don't necessarily align with the day-to-day experiences. So therefore, like the positive education, you're sort of constantly stressed because you're constantly haunted by the fact that you're not really living up to those ideals that are constantly in front of you. Supposedly everyone else evidently is. That's, I think, what you.
Okay, so I think where there's an overlap in what I was saying and what you guys are describing is I do think that there are thinking traps that one can fall into, right? One of my favorite expressions is don't compare your insides to other people's outsides, right? And this idea that, and actually I have a slide later on where we'll talk about this idea that everybody, and social media exacerbates this, that everybody's perfect life is out there all the time in this relentless onslaught of parties that I wasn't invited to. Kind of gets there, but really everybody is feeling the same way about all that same phenomenon, right? So that's part of this. But positive education doesn't mean you're happy all the time. Positive psychology doesn't mean you're happy all the time. This is not incessant joy training, right? This is how do we think about the things that make our lives feel better, and how do we intentionally apply ourselves towards that process? Right? Positive psychology, one of the words that we'll get to later on is mindfulness, not so much as meditation, but as a practice of intentional acts, a practice of controlling your mind so that you're able to focus your energies towards the things that are important to you. A lot of times, that has nothing to do with joy or happiness. I was not happy in a joy sense when I was studying for the bar. I was freaking the fuck out. Right? But it was a happy time in my life because I knew what I was supposed to do. I had an opportunity to prepare. I was surrounded by people that I cared about doing something similar in an activity that was meaningful to us. It was intellectually challenging. And all of those things meant that it actually was, in retrospect, a very positive time in my life because I knew what I was doing and where I was going, and I was taking steps to get there that were of my design. Right? So I think that the fact that we're talking about positive education is not intended to send a message that you guys should be happy all the time, but it's intended to give a framework to you guys for how to do this for yourselves and your students that will help them embrace learning in ways that are meaningful to them over time.
So I'm a parent of 2 young kids, 5 and 3. Isn't there a book like All Joy and No Fun or something like that about when I hear you say that, I think about parenting and I think about stress and I think about this morning. You time everything perfectly, gotta be here at 8:30. You wake up, you shower, somebody says, I think I'm gonna throw up, somebody else says, don't leave, the sitter comes in, somebody's got a fever, to yell at somebody. Like, that's stress. And you could frame it positively like, I care about both things. I care about my children most of the time. I care about my children deeply. I care about my job deeply. I don't want to come across as the person who's late, slinking in the back, sitting in the back, because we all know what Steve thinks about sitting in the back. Yeah. So how can you reframe that?
You just did. You just did. I care about my kids. I care about my job. I mean, I know that the times I'm most stressed are when I have a conflict in those two areas of my life, for sure. But I also know that my kids get to see me handle that conflict. They get to see me having a full life. They get to conceive of my life as something that has aspects that are of them and aspects that aren't of them. I know actually when I really stop and think about it, I know actually that my kids are developing some resilience and some independence in those situations as well. Right? So these are things that I can talk myself through because my choices are abandon my job, abandon my kids, and those are not choices I'm willing to make. Some people actually do make those choices, right? Some people walk out on their kids and that's how they square the circle. I'm not willing to make that choice personally, and so I have to do other things to remind myself of that. My wife is fond of saying, she's a working mom, she's fond of saying, a good marriage is nice, good childcare is essential. Right? So I know where I fit in that, but I actually don't disagree with it because that's hard and you need to deal with it. But I think as you're driving in your car, reminding yourself of that and reminding yourselves that your colleagues all have kids and they know what it's like when you walk into the room, right? And that people aren't looking at you and thinking, this is a woman who can't hack it. They're thinking, we all have these moments when we're running 3 minutes late because somebody puked. Right? And one of the things that I've experienced in the law is that when guys come in and say something like that, it's really charming. And when women come in and say something like that, it's like, what's the matter with you? You're a terrible mom. Right? And so I think as a society, we're getting better at that. But I know that that's also a residual thing that my wife has to handle is her feeling of her own perceived, gender role and the balancing of that. So it's hard, but it's a great example. But it's about how you help it. And if you didn't have that childcare, you would need to go out and figure that out so that the babysitter, comes and you're managing that as well. And all of that is a process of dialogue to yourself about this is what I'm doing to have a full life and show that to my kids.
So where does guilt factor in?
It's part of the conversation you have with yourself, and the more you remind yourself about why you're doing it and the underlying reasons, the easier it gets to square that in your own mind. But it's a process. We have a hand up here. So I'm not sure if this is going to be a responsive answer to your question or not. I'm going to try my best. I think that there are times when there are reactions to things that we do, right? Our actions are going to lead to reactions, and sometimes those are predictable and sometimes not. Both can be stressful. But I think that the relationships that you have with the people at work, Steve's job is to get everybody here in this room attentive and focused and to run that process. So his job is, come in, sit in the front row, pay attention, everybody up front, and this is when we're going to start. And I got to have some meeting hygiene so that we get the whole group together in a kind of a semi-disciplined way, right? That's not the same, tell me your name. Annie. That's not the same as Annie sucks at her job. Right? I have a job to do, Annie has a job to do, she's a talented professional, and if she's a little bit late, I'm going to call her out because I don't want her to be a little bit late, but it doesn't mean that she's on some sort of double secret probation and at risk of losing her career. Right? And we all have to have the sort of trust and the ability to step back from our stress to remind ourselves of that, to better handle our reaction and try to stay on a little bit more of that even keel. Is that helpful? Does anybody else have a positive, a stress that somebody reframed helpfully for them? Sure.
Courtney's a math student, so I was obviously lucky to chat with her, but one of mine was the evening kind of small child pickup. And, if I get stuck here every minute, then it goes later, one less minute
It's lovely the way you care for each other.
And one issue is like, just think of it as you don't have to go home and feed Paige, you get to go home and feed Paige and get her back and stuff. And it's so simple, but it doesn't.
Yeah, so instead of this is the time when we have to go back and have this very rigid schedule and I have to get it all right or there's catastrophe in the morning, it's this is the time period that I get to go and spend time with my daughter, right? This is the time that we get to have bath time together or dinner time together or whatever it is, right? And it's funny, you know, the PERMA framework, I'm sure you guys have been told, the positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning or mattering, and accomplishment or achievement as sort of the facets of a well-rounded life. One of the things that I think is not necessarily reflected in that the way I think it should be is self-compassion and self-forgiveness. Right? I actually think a big part of well-being is reminding yourself that you're not perfect, and that's okay. That it's moving towards a goal, not necessarily embodying the ideal that is what we do in life. And I think that's a big part of it. And you just gave an example of that, right? This is an opportunity for me to get to do these things. And maybe some days that means, you know, Chef Boyardee for dinner. Because I don't have the time or the energy and I'm just going to open it in a can, dump it in a bowl and heat it up, right? But that's okay because we're still getting the together time and my daughter's going to be, that's what's the more meaningful thing, right? So those are great examples of how to do this. I had when I did this with the seed class, I had a student who said, what really stresses me out is having to go to physical workouts. Right? I just hate that stuff. I'm not an athlete. I don't feel like it's something I'm good at. I don't really enjoy it. And I don't really see why they put us through that if it's something we don't enjoy. And I said, well, you know, if you think about it, one of the things that you probably have learned in SEED is that 30 minutes a day of exercise actually gives you more cognitive capacity. It actually helps you focus your brain more on the intellectual things. And so if instead of thinking about this as a crappy morning workout that you hate that you have to do, if you think of it as this is an investment I'm making actually in my brain through my body, and Shipley is helping me and giving me time to do that so that when I go do the things that I really enjoy, like English or Spanish or you know, STEM or whatever it is, I'm better able to do that and I'm going to get more out of that for myself. And I find that if you can kind of figure out ways to make it about something selfish, you know, that really helps. And you know, I don't know if she ever actually did it, but she reacted positively in the moment, which was really all that I needed to feel good. Okay. So, I used to talk about the East German judge in the Olympics, and then I realized that I had dated myself well out of most audiences that I was speaking to. So I've updated the reference, right? But the point is, and this was sort of where I was getting at with my initial response to your cognitive dissonance point, was we've all got different voices going on in our head, right? And some of those voices are really, really critical. And in fact, most of those voices are more critical because of the aforementioned negativity bias, right? We give more evidence, we give more credence, and we give more focus to negative things because the downside of ignoring a negative thing is more dangerous than the downside of ignoring a positive thing. And so one of the tricks of the trade in looking at stress as a positive and the whole definition of reframing is to not pay attention to your inner Simon, right? He's just being an ass for ratings. He's just telling you the negative because he puts him out there and gives him prominence and the lights, but it's not necessarily objective or real. He's got an agenda, right? Recognize that the negative voice in your head has an agenda and you're more prone to listen to it. Now, I'm not necessarily saying follow your inner Paula either. Okay? Because I don't know what she's taking and it looks like fun, but it's not necessarily giving me a real view of the world either, right? It's not all sunshine and light and rainbows and unicorns as lovely as those are. Okay? But I would suggest that if you think about your inner Paula and your inner Simon, you'll probably end up with your inner Randy. Okay? And your inner Randy will be like, all right, dog. Like, maybe not the best song choice. I'm not sure I would have envisioned you singing that song, but you did a pretty good job of it, and I really like what you do, and I feel like you took a real risk with that, right? And it's not going to be perfect every time, and I still think you're going to be here next week, right? Finding that balance of objectivity with ourselves is really hard to do. Another way that this exercise that I'm calling Embrace Your Inner Idol Judge gets done is, what would you tell your best friend if they were saying to you what you're saying to yourself? Right? If your best friend comes to you and says, oh my God, class sucked today. I was terrible, right? I did this wrong, and Maggie asked this question that I didn't know the answer to, and then I wasn't prepared, and we went too long, and it was just, and everybody thinks I'm terrible, right? You may say that to yourself after a bad class, but when your best friend says it to you, your response to them is very, very different, right? It's much more supportive, it's much more balanced, it's kinder. And one of the things that happens when we're stressed is we're not kind to ourselves about it because we're distracted, our cognitive energies are sapped, right? Taking that step back and thinking, what would I say to my best friend if he or she were in that situation is another way of distancing yourself from your inner Simon and trying to find your inner Randy and get that balance to reassure yourself that what you've done is, not life-threatening or life-changing and you're going to move on. Questions there? So, so we all have these things, right? Like I think it was Virginia Woolf who said, I don't love writing, I love having written. And so for me, it's like I know I've got a paper that is due for submission and I've got to get through the draft and get it out there for comments and sitting down to actually bang out my thoughts. So we all have those drudgeries. And what I find useful and what I think the science would suggest is to reset the drudgery within a higher order goal. So one way to think about this is the distributional classes that you had to take in college to satisfy general requirements that had nothing to do with things you were interested in. So you want to go be a philosophy student and you're being forced to take some gut intro bio class and oh my God, right? But what you're doing is actually teaching your brain to think about a different group of information using different skills that you might actually be able to apply in novel ways to these things, and you're setting a requirement off, ticking a box for something that is important to you, which is graduating from college with a degree that's going to move you somewhere that you want to go with a little bit more intentionality and agency, right? And so that gives you the drudgery in a larger, more self-centered, more selfish, but also more supportive to yourself context that gives you a little bit more motivation to go and do it. I've been having this conversation with my son, who's a freshman on the lacrosse team at Penn, and is at the bottom of the depth chart right now. So the season opener's on Saturday, and he's going to a bunch of practices where he knows he's not going to see the field. And the question is, why am I at practice 2 to 6 every day when I know I'm not going to actually get to play? And the answer is, maybe you don't want to be, and maybe you stop, and all of those alternatives are out there, but in the meantime, you're getting better. And you're playing on the scout team against the first team, which is going to make you better, and you're learning other teams' offenses, which is going to make you better, and all of this is part of the process. So yes, it's drudgery, but it's drudgery with a purpose, and that purpose matters to me. Is that helpful? Yeah. It does take a lot of time. That's exactly right. So I do. So one of the slides that got skipped over by rapid mouse here.
Why is it only certain?
And oh my God, we're going to have to listen to her again. Okay, is this one? Okay, so there are stresses that we can change and stresses that we can't. For stresses that we can change, we want to alter them or maybe avoid them, right? Maybe I don't drive the way the bus goes. When I'm driving to school, I try to avoid the bus route because I know that's going to stress me out, or I try to drive at a different time of the day or whatever else it might be, right? Then there are stressors that we can't change, which is, my mom's getting older, right? That's going to stress me out and there's nothing I can do about it. Faculty meetings could be either of those, right? One possibility is that you talk about how to restructure the faculty meeting in a way that everybody's engaged. That may get met with a yes, we'll do that, or no, we won't, and now you know whether you can change it or not and which one of these categories you're in, right? But I would say that a lot of organizations have spent a lot of time on the phrase I used earlier, meeting hygiene, right? How do we make our meetings effective, efficient, engaging, and useful instead of monotonous, routine, unhelpful, and boring? And that is something that you can think about, you can focus on, and you can offer suggestions to to deal with. And hopefully in an environment that is sort of thinking and thoughtful about everybody's time, that will be helpful. So that would be my answer there, is I wouldn't necessarily reframe that as much as I would try to engage it and think about how I could make those meetings better and communicate with my colleagues on doing so. I would also be willing to hear feedback if I were leading those meetings on how to make them better. I think that has to happen on both sides. Yep.
I might be jumping ahead, but
that's okay, I can do that in like 5 slides right now.
So filtering all of this to our students, right? And so the wolf, I teach upper school. So the wolf for our students, I believe, is that Penn admissions person. So getting into college. And the sick child for our students would be the amount of homework, let's say, that they have at night. And so encouraging my students, or our students we co-teach, Kate and I, to reframe some of this. I think a lot of our kids, or my advisees even, could buy into that. But then the reality would be, I think many of the kids would say, well, I still need to stay up until 11, 12 o'clock at night doing my homework. And you were talking about earlier about, some nights just having the, canned pasta for dinner, right? And so some kids, the reality for our kids would be that they don't produce strong homework some nights. But then they worry about the grades. And we live in a culture here in this mainline community where the kids can see they're running averages at all times. And as you know, the admissions, people are, things are changing and so on. And so how do we take, and I buy into all this, right? And I'm trying to model it to my students. But I'm also not a student myself. And I can go home, and I don't have homework until 11 or 12 o'clock at night. I have other things. But so, how can we filter all of this to our kids? What can we say to our students to get them, because looking at this slide, here's something that is happening, I think, in so many schools in this area. We are altering the stressor. We are altering the level of rigor because of the stress. And I worry about that. Because by altering the rigor, it's also not preparing them to reach the pen or to reach the school perhaps that they want to go to.
Yeah, so it won't surprise you to know that I don't think there's a universal answer to this question. I don't think there's a silver bullet answer that's going to make all of these kids not be stressed. But in fact, what I'm saying is, yeah, you're going to be stressed. Think about that stress. And that stress is not so much, for me, the reframing of it is, believe it or not, and I know that there are a million messages to the contrary, if you look at the parents of the people you go to school with, you will see that many of them went to Harvard, and just as many of them went to some other school you've never heard of, right? That there's a vast diversity in the colleges of the parents of the people that you know. And if you were to go to Radnor or Harriton or Strawberry Mansion, or wherever else, you would see vast backgrounds of different people who all go on and have lives. And the idea, the myth, that there is one perfect life and it only happens if you go to one of these 8 schools is just that. It's something you're being fed, and if we're doing anything at a place like Shipley, it is delivering that message as powerfully as possible so that there is a counter-narrative. Does it mean that the kids aren't swimming upstream to get that counter-narrative? I mean, I get that there's lots of other pressures out there, and that's why I say I don't know that there's a silver bullet. But I think that at least with the upper school kids, I mean, Maggie's not ignorant of the stresses that are going on. What she needs to hear is that there's another message that's out there, and it's not the soul-crushing need for perfectionism all the time, right? We need to prevent that. We need to say that if you're failing, that's because you're pushing yourself. Failing, I'm using it with a small f, right? Like, if you are struggling, you are pushing yourself. And we need to then have the communication with the Penn admissions counselor that they understand what we're doing. And I've spoken to those people too, and they understand the value of a program like what you guys are putting together here, right? When Maggie transferred here from Baldwin, I was the helicopter dad, and I called the admissions office. I work at Penn. What do you guys think? And they were like, awesome school. Shipley's awesome. We take all their kids. Well, not all their kids, but I mean, they're fabulous, right? We take we take every bit as many kids from Shipley as any other school out there, and there is no material reduction. Whatever you might have heard about Baldwin, Shipley is just as rigorous as far as what the kids are capable of doing when they come out, right? So, you can't change the stressors that are out there in life. What you can do is say, this is how you should talk to yourself about stress. This is what you should realize. When you are doing this to put yourself in a position where you maximize your options in life. And then you're going to make a choice about where you go to college, and then you're going to make a choice about what you go have to do after that, and then you're going to make a choice about who you marry, and sooner or later, you're going to look back and realize that you've had a life. And the question is, not, is your life going to be over? Because the answer to that is no if you don't get into an Ivy League school. The question is, what are you going to do next? And I think if we can deliver that message and have them start to think about stress that way, we will be equipping them actually to be in that better position when they graduate. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you think somewhere in all of this formula, stress is a positive thing? Do you think it's equally positive to walk away from the stress, right, to avoid it? So to say, I understand that there's a stress here, but the goal that stress will lead me to is not a goal I want to accomplish. Are we equally wise to suggest that to our students? Like, I don't want to go to Penn, so I don't need to take that honors class. That's not a stress I need.
So having a son that goes to Penn and a daughter who had no interest in Penn at all, right? I mean, I think that empowerment of you need to make the decisions that are meaningful to you, but here's the skill set that we're giving you so that when you do that, it's thoughtful, right? Because one of the things that we know is that this age group makes impetuous decisions. They don't necessarily have that long-range view. They don't necessarily have the benefit of the skills. And so, making sure that there are, well, what's an analogy I could use? That we've put the bumpers up on the bowling lanes so that they're not throwing a gutter ball, right? Because some of them may be inclined to throw a gutter ball because they don't have a longer picture in mind because they're 16 and 17 years old. So I think with some constraints, yes, I do think it's perfectly, I have a good friend who went to Penn and then went skiing and, never came back, right? He's a pretty happy dude. Is that a bad life choice? I don't know. I don't think so. Right? He's a happier dude than a lot of my guys who went to McKinsey. They have other things going on in their lives that they're proud of. That's the choice that he made. So for me, it isn't the choice. It's the intentionality and the deliberateness and the self-awareness that they use to make the choice that is what's important and that I think they get from you guys. Certainly, that's one of the things that Maggie has gotten from you guys, right? So I guess okay, so I'm running low on time. But the clicker will help. Okay, so one of the things to talk to your kids about and to talk to yourself about is this is actually the thing that helps moderate stress more than anything else. Regular eating, regular sleeping, regular exercise. Notice that I'm not saying always get 8 to 10 hours a day. Certainly that's what the science says is maximum, but your kids are studying until 11 o'clock at night. I mean, there are times when you're going to, in life, there are times when I've had to pull all-nighters, right? There are times when I didn't exercise, but generally having that be there. And if you're looking for a tsunami buoy on kids in crisis, kids who are not eating, not sleeping, not exercising, those are the kids, when those basic things become difficult to do, that's when you've got a kid in crisis. Okay, I am not a psychiatrist or a clinical professional, but those are the big ticket items that when I have talked to clinical professionals about kids I was worried about, those are the questions that they come back to me with, right? So reminding these kids to do the best they can in these arenas all the time and doing so yourself. Take a break, get something to eat. It will help you move forward. That's a big one. How to prepare for sleep is another one, right? Yes, you've got a lot of work to do, but don't do it on your computer during the last hour. And try to put your stuff aside for an hour before you go to sleep. And for God's sake, don't be on Snapchat or Facebook 5 minutes before you go to sleep, right? The screens aren't good for you. They reduce your melatonin. They make it harder for you to go to sleep. And then spend 5 minutes, and I know you guys all know the gratitude exercise, you got the gratitude journals, right? But that 5 minutes of reflection, one of the things the MAP program really gave me was the value of taking a few minutes to reflect on a regular basis. How did today go? What did I like about it? What would I like to do better tomorrow? Getting up in the morning. What's my plan for the day? What am I excited about? What am I worried about? How do I prepare for that? 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes at night really helps your sleep patterns and your view of the day. This is a study that came out of Penn just about 4 months ago on limiting social media and its impact on loneliness and depression. You guys know FOMO, that's the fear of missing out, right? And the idea is that we're watching social media all the time and we're seeing everybody's best lives. Just by limiting our social media on the big 4 apps to 15 minutes per app per day, right? Kids with high loneliness and depression showed meaningful reductions in both loneliness and depression symptoms. The kids at the bottom who were already sort of low for those things didn't change. So by reducing their social media, we had no impact on them, but that's what we would have expected. But the kids who were already depressed and lonely saw a material reduction, not by changing anything else, but just by limiting their social media use. I think that's an important thing for us all to keep in mind, right? Am I successful at it? No, Maggie's on Snapchat all the freaking time. But it's something to pay more attention to as you see those symptoms increase. Okay, so mindfulness, we had a little video on that I'm not going to show, but I'll send you guys a link for. The purpose of that was just to say meditation and mindfulness are different. Meditation is great, but if I say it to a room full of lawyers, they all throw up, right? But mindfulness is about where you put your brain to think about things that are important to you, and reminding yourself when you go off on a tangent is what we're really talking about here. This is the note, compare your insides to other people's outsides. The kids loved this slide. So at Penn, we have something called Penn face. Penn face is the face you put on as you walk down Locust Walk that says, I'm totally fine, while inside you're freaking out about how you're failing. Stanford calls it duck syndrome. Duck syndrome is that everybody sees the top half of the duck just smoothly gliding along the water, while below the water, it's all furious paddling and craziness, right? But think about this. Places I've cried on the Stanford campus, and they get 1,000 members, right? Everybody. The fact that duck syndrome and Penn face exist, God bless it. The fact that these things exist is indicative itself of the fact that we're all feeling this way. Right? And when you get these feelings and you feel like you're the only one who's struggling, think about Stanford's Places I've Cried and Penn's Wall of Rejection, and remind yourself that we're all struggling. And another thing that I get from a lot of people in sort of this demographic is, how can I feel bad when there are so many people worse off than me? Right? And this is a big one with my wife, right? It's how can I feel bad when I'm driving and there's the guy outside of 30th Street Station with a cardboard sign. Like, how can I feel bad when I've got it so much better? And the answer to that is we're all struggling with something, and all of those things are meaningful to us, right? And there are people that you might think are doing better than you who have their own struggles. We've all got them. We've all got our places that we've cried. We've all got our walls of rejection. And that universality is something that we can actually use to bring us closer, because what Kelly Mcgonigal says when she's summarizing her talk is that when you are stressed, you produce cortisol, and cortisol is actually a social hormone. It drives us, when we feel stressed, to go find other people and engage them, because we are safer when we are not alone, okay? So the biggest thing I would tell you is, when you're stressed, find a colleague, find a family member, find somebody you trust, and talk to them. Let them be your best friend, you be theirs. Remember that we're all in this together, that we're all suffering from the same things, and find that positive reframing through the social connections that you have, and it will help you deal with your stress in a more productive way going forward. Thanks very much for your time. Thank you for my 5-minute warning. That was really helpful. Oh, thank you. I'm so glad you were here.
Lisa Shirley, I'm a Harvard School Well, I never taught Maggie, but I know who she is. She's a lovely girl. Like, you know. So just, can I ask a favor? Of course. So, I really enjoyed the talk.
I love your shirt.
Thank you. It's my positive education.
Nice to see you. I need to take a look. I need to be on campus so much. Yeah.
So, when you say Maggie's in, that's great. But if you could, like, to me, when you say to me because she got into college, that sort of minimizes what I do. Because I mean, it's not that I don't want them to get into college, and that is an important part of it, but it really makes me feel like Stanley Kaplan's apprentice. You know, Stanley Kaplan, the SAT person, right? As opposed to someone who's passionate about helping people become more engaged.
Yeah, so that I'll be more careful about that.
So, like I said, I just
because when I say Maggie's a win, what I mean is Maggie is a person who has come out of the school with the capacity to know where she wants to go
and know what she wants, right? And she got there, and those are all great things, and right, but it's not. That's a broader picture than she got into college early. That's all that I'm saying.
And so I was intending to deliver the larger picture, and I apologize that my word choice was a little bit more.
I usually go to comfy
I know, and it didn't like.
It's very helpful because I don't want to convey that, so I really.
It's just. I used to teach college. And when people heard I taught college, they'd be like, "Oh my God, you're so smart," and then they wouldn't talk to me.
They just had a big.
And now I teach high school, and they're like, "You teach high school? Let me tell you what you should be doing," and they don't listen to me, right? And I'm the same person, so it's really fascinating to me the way how we culturally view high school teachers. You know, and probably even more for middle and lower school teachers.
Well, it's a very useful reframing for me.
So I just, like I said, I think this is great. I think it's a message our kids need to hear. Thank you.
Yes, and I am enjoying that so much. Are you ready now?
Yes, well, she really loves that class. She's been wanting to get in that class.
I know. We are having fun.
It's in fish time right off.
Good. Well, it sounds to me like she's taking some risks with writing.
She is. I hope she will with the poetry.
You can see, like ska bands there.
Having fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to thank you. Sorry if I was aggressive.
No, not at all. They're
It's
important
I care
questions.
about all the stuff as I know you do.
Yeah, well, that's the whole theme, right? So I appreciate it, and it's an important question, and I just we have to teach them how to pull the narratives they need out of the maelstrom of narratives that are out there.
And I talk about it as like, discomfort in certain forms. That's how you know that you're growing.
Mm-hmm.
And this is my second year shifting. I've been trying to communicate that when I'm coaching or in the classroom, and it's hitting home more with the kids and families, but it's an uphill battle with some kids and families. And for coaches, some coaches do have to justify you're running today, and parents are calling the next day, why did you run my daughter so? So it's interesting to get some of the feedback and then to communicate in constructive ways to kids.
It is a challenge.
And then the tests or debates or whatever are running or things in the classroom.
Yes. Yeah, well, I mean, even at Penn, we have a very substantial group of students that want to do it great. And, is that going to help you?
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
So, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks.
And I'll check out the next time.
Yeah, come through next time. Okay. Only thing I can say is try pointing the receiver's actually back in the booth, not here.
Okay.
So try pointing it towards the back, and that may kind of shift you a little bit.
That does seem to work better.
Other than that, yeah, but that it's like right in
How
the
did it
window
sound
right
on the?
It sounded good.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny. I actually played the processing shows.
Oh, did you?
Yeah. I have a love-hate relationship with Franklin. So I was a goalie, and you can't see the ball coming off the bleachers because the bleachers are gray in Franklin Field. It's extremely hard. We always had high-scoring games against Penn and Drexel in Franklin Field.
And that's funny. So those little things really matter. So we play St. Joe's at St. Joe's this year.
Do you? That guy's done an awesome job. Their head coach.
That seems to be on the rise.
Yeah.
So which is great. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it's done.
Yeah, it's cool. I actually grew up in Baltimore, so it's good.
Oh, where'd you go to school?
DeMatha Catholic.
Okay, I went to Severn.
Did you?
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
I didn't play,
No.
but
We always played Severn.
I was 70 pounds lighter in the same height, so it would have been a bad idea.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was those were fun days.
Oh yeah. But yeah, it's interesting. It's a funny little story. They get that advantage, but I don't know if you.
Yeah. Well, is it all the way around, or it's only on altered quarters, right? Because is it the stone building, or is it when you're facing the horseshoe?
Bleachers. It's the actual concrete bleachers because it's almost the color of the ball. So I guess
So hopefully we put you there on the fourth quarter. Yeah, hopefully the goalies are used to it there, but
you learn which end to take and what's up. It's just interesting.
that's fun.
Does he like it?
That's kind of what I said, right? I think he's very proud of it, but I think he wants to do better, right? Every time you go to another level, you reset your expectations. And he wants to be first team All Ivy right out of the chute. So figuring out how he's going to get there and realizing, one of the attacker on his team was the Big Ten Player of the Week in his first week of freshman year, lacrosse. So it's like, why does TJ all of a sudden start crushing it when I'm here fifth line, right?
It's one of those things. Some people they progress quickly and then plateau, or it takes a second to click and you pick it out.
You get in the right situation. So, all right, I'll pass this out. There's no point in lying on a self-reported questionnaire.
I mean, it's really hilarious because the first one is the why stress is a good thing. I know I'm wrong, but I'm still going to say what I would normally say.
If that's what you would normally say, then you're right.
Yeah, I would normally say that it's negative. Sorry.
Self-deception is not quite the same thing as a positive or critical stress. So we got very hushed, but I think we still have like 5 more minutes before we actually sort of bell it right at 11:15. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you want us to fill this out now?
You can, or you can have it later. I mean, we're going to talk about it and what it means. So if you do it now, that's a useful use of your time, I think, but it's not like you're getting ready. enhance your stress by giving you a task, but I think it's okay, why don't we get started? So I want to thank you guys for being here, in part because I understand that one of your alternatives was sleep yoga, right? And like the idea of like yoga where you don't have to move, like that's my whole problem with yoga is I can't get in those movements. So that's like the perfect yoga. And so thank you for turning your backs on perfect yoga to talk about how to reframe stress as a positive. My name is John Hallway. I am a huge fan of your work. I am a dean at the law school at Penn. I do work in criminal justice reform, and I spent time there trying to help different parts of the criminal justice system that have political reasons to not like each other come together to talk about cases in the criminal justice system where things have gone wrong. So wrongful convictions, officer-involved shootings, deaths in custody. And in having those conversations and helping those people have difficult conversations, I started thinking about what we could do to help people see the best in one another. Right about that time, I realized that I had teenagers. One of whom is Maggie Hallway, who's a senior here at Shipley. And some of you I know are teaching her now and have taught her a lot. Then I watched my wife, who's the chair of her law firm, deal with the fact that lawyers have very high rates of substance abuse, suicide, depression, skepticism, and loneliness. And all of these things started me thinking about how we could work to help people's day-to-day lives better. That brought me to the MAP program, which I know you guys are familiar with. So I graduated from that last year. And my learnings from MAP and all these other things are sort of synthesized into this conversation, which I gave to a seed section, and I guess it couldn't have been that bad because they asked me to come back and give it to you guys. So that's kind of who I am and why I'm here, but I want to just express my deep admiration for you guys because I've now seen the process of a 9th grade girl who isn't exactly sure who she is and has ideas about who she wants to be and all the conflicting narratives that they get. And I saw her come from an atmosphere where she was not happy and come here and just blossom, right? And Maggie is, put her applications together, is going to the college of her choice, which I think is a really important thing to say and not like whatever school it is, right? The important thing is she figured out a school that was right for her, and you guys gave her the tools to do that. And she's just a joy every day for me, but watching her flourish here has been really meaningful. So thank you for what you do because my daughter's a win. I'm just going to kind of set the stage. This is a little bit of sand to the beach for you guys because you've done the positive education thing and you know more about this than most audiences that I talk about. These are actually the spheres of well-being that the University of Pennsylvania has for its community on their wellness website. And the point of this is just to say that we're going to talk about stress and we're going to talk about how we use stress to improve our well-being and why stress isn't necessarily a bad thing. When we talk about well-being, we're talking about different facets of our lives and how we bring them into a balance that is subjectively meaningful to us, right? And what those spheres are, we could argue about. I think for high school and college kids, the sexual phase is an important one. When the ABA talks about well-being for lawyers, they just put that under social. Right? We're not going to talk about that at work. That's on you. We hope it's going well. Social. Okay? So the spheres might be different, and in different contexts, we're going to promote different things. And at different times of our lives, different things are going to come to the fore, right? There are times when if I'm in school, maybe my intellectual well-being is going to be really high, and if I'm not paying attention to it, my physical well-being might languish a little bit. And so some of this is about keeping these things in balance, but also understanding that there's different periods of our lives where different things are important. And when we talk about stress and well-being in that context, we're talking about sort of our whole selves, and often what we do when those phases of our life are in conflict, right? The most stressful moments for me are moments when I've got to do something at work, but Maggie's calling me from school. That's not good. And I'm on a conference call, but I want to answer that phone. And how do I do that? Because something's going to suffer that's important to me in either of those situations, right? So it's about bringing those things into balance and doing so kind of intentionally. And one of the things that I see at Penn is that people tend to use well-being as a code phrase for suicide prevention. right? So when we talk about well-being, we're talking about almost a binary thing, a 0 or 1. You're in crisis or you're well. You're well or you're unwell, right? And that's not really how I think about well-being or how I think the positive psychology and that science considers well-being. So I tend to think of well-being as a spectrum from -10 to 10. And yes, most of us probably sit around the middle of this. We're like between -2 and +2 a lot of the time, where things in our life are going well and things in our life are going not as well, and we're dealing, right? That's how it is. And certainly, but you know, life is a spectrum from people who are in crisis to the times in your life where everything is awesome, right? Now, the last audience must have more kids because they got the Lego movie reference, and I got more laughs out of that one. So this is Emmett from the Lego movie, and Emmett is... Okay, so I had this problem before. The clicker can be, see, it does that. And I'm supposed to point there, it worked better. God bless it. Okay, and yes. All right, anyway, we're on that spectrum from crisis to everything is awesome, right? And the idea is not so much to, you know, the people who are in crisis need real medical help, and generally most of us are not in a position to give that. What we need to be able to do is identify it and help those people get the help that they need. For most of us, what we're trying to do when we talk about positive psychology and well-being is to move people to the right on that spectrum, to get them from -2 into the positive numbers as high as we can help them get and have them understand what that looks like and feels like for them, so that when the inevitable curveballs of life happen to us, when we get in a car accident, when our company folds, when our parents get sick, the things that will happen in any life that doesn't just all go perfectly, we have some preventative armor and preventative tools and mechanisms so that we don't slide back into that crisis range, but instead we slide from a 2 to a -2 for a period of time, and then we bounce back from that and get back onto a more even keel. So that's the context in which I'm going to be talking to you about stress, because one of the theses that I'm going to give you is that stress is unavoidable, and that on one sort of conscious level we might think, God, I wish I could do away with all this stress, but that actually stress has a really important purpose in our lives, and it's actually really very useful. And if we can remind ourselves of that, it actually changes both our body's response to the stress and helps us get more positive outcomes from the stress. Now I'm clicking to this slide. And the point of this slide is, this is actually something that I do specifically when I'm speaking to educators, right? You guys all get this metaphor. This is, put the oxygen mask on yourself before you administer to your child in the instance of a loss in cabin pressure, right? And the reason this is important is that you can't tend to the child and protect the child if you yourself are not taking care of yourself. And as educators, you guys are all about helping your students. And as the recipient of that love, again, I thank you. But it's really important that as you're listening to this talk, don't just think about how you're going to apply it in your classroom. Think about how you're going to apply it to yourself. Because you're no good to me dead, right? I need you, Maggie needs you, and we need you to be feeling like you yourselves are taking the steps you need to be well too, and to manage your stress as well. So I know you're going to think about how you apply it in your classroom. Intuitively, that's what you're going to do, and that's awesome. But take the moment also to step back and think about how you're going to think about it for yourselves and your own reframing of things. Okay, so what is stress? From an evolutionary perspective, stress is a threat to our environment, right? And that might be a little threat, it might be a big threat, right? But the wolf represents sort of the evolutionary approach to stress. Our bodies are wired when there is a threat in our environment to focus on that threat. Stress is a process, a physiological process of zooming our cognitive energy in on something that is perceived to be a threat in our environment. And there is a negativity bias that is wired into that. The downside of ignoring a wolf is greater than the downside of ignoring a rainbow, right? So we are wired to really pay attention to negative things that happen and threats in our environment, and that generates a physiological response that says, pay attention. It may be exams, it may be other things. Oh, man. The Christine Blasey Ford testimony I put up here because everybody in this environment is stressed, right? She's stressed because she's going to stand up in public and say some very difficult things that she knows in advance a lot of people are going to hate her for. Her lawyers are stressed, their reputations, their jobs, and the fact that they care about her and have prepared her for something that they know is going to be taxing and difficult, but that they view as important. That's stressful. The people in the audience are stressed about this because this is about a Supreme Court nomination that's going to have an impact on a lot of people's lives. But there's one other thing that made me put this particular picture up here, which is that when we showed the testimony on screens all around the law school, given its importance in particular to our audience, we had some students come to Student Affairs and say, please turn it off. I can't take it. It's too much for me, right? And there are stresses just in our environment that are kind of above and beyond our ability to control them. So for my son, when he was 8, he was very concerned about nuclear war. It freaked him out. It stressed him out. This idea that at any moment a city could explode was hard for him to process, and it was just out there in the environment, and it was stressful. Right? And so when we're dealing with stress, we have to find ways to acknowledge all of these pressures on us. Some of them we've chosen, like the fact that we're going to school and we have to take, from time to time, we have to try to show mastery of the various topics we're learning. Some of them are just out there. Some of them are part of our careers and what we do when the moments that we're training for happen, right? So all of those things are examples of stress. And when stress happens, our body has a physical response, many of which I'm experiencing right now, right? I'm standing up in front of you guys and delivering something that I hope you're not going to hate me for or think I do poorly, right? That's stressful, right? So I'm having the adrenaline, the elevated heart rate, the blood pressure. For me, one of my stress responses is in the 30 seconds or so before I started talking, I really had to pee. Right? And I recognize that now as part of my stress response, and it actually helps me manage it. It's like, oh, it must be getting time for me to talk now. Right? The cortisol is a release of blood glucose that narrows your lens of cognitive focus. That's a blessing and a curse. The blessing is that you're focused on something, right? The curse is that you might miss things in the periphery that might actually help you solve the problem or deal with the stress. So again, being aware of the response, understanding what's happening, then helps you with a counter reaction that pulls you back. One of the things that I teach at the law school is a class on errors in criminal justice. One of those topics is inaccurate eyewitness identifications. If there's a gun present at a crime, people's eyewitness identifications are not as accurate. Why? Because you focus on the freaking gun. Because that's the biggest threat in your environment. Not the person holding the gun itself. And all of your attention zooms in on that. It becomes much harder to take a step back and think about what the person holding the gun actually looks like. Right? So we know we have these responses and that's what it's doing. It's telling us something in your environment is here that's important that you need to focus on. These actually are things that stress us out in the workplace. Any of these resonate? Right? I mean, this is one of those things where you're like, oh yeah, I hate all those things. All those things stress me out, and all those things happen at different times in my life, but particularly, they might happen at work. But what I want to talk to you now about is why stress is a good thing. And so all of the things that I've told you about stress that are negatives actually also share this characteristic. Stress is what arises when something you care about is at stake. Right? So I get stressed about public speaking because I care about this message and I want you to get something out of it and I want to communicate it effectively to you. You guys care about your classes because you want your students to respond well and absorb things and go on and take these teachings and benefit and profit and grow, right? When I'm stressed about that tension between Maggie calling and my conference call, it's because I know I have responsibilities to work and I want to do it well, but I know I have responsibilities to Maggie, and if she's got a need, I want to be there for her. These are all things that I care about, and that means that all of these things are opportunities for me to rise to the occasion and do something useful for something that matters to me. And so a big theme of the reframing of stress is going to be, how do you take this thing that feels like a negative and remind yourself that the reason it's in your life is for a purpose that's actually there to help you, something that you care about. And that's what we're going to talk about when we say reframing. We're going to say, actually be a little selfish here. right? Think about why this matters to me. And sometimes that means going to a fairly high-level big picture to get through these long-range things that might be drudgery or something. But that's the whole process. Remind yourself when you are stressed that this is a signal that it is time for you to focus on something that matters to you. Now, the codicil of that is that we're not going to be able to do away with stress, right? You will have stress as long as there is something in your life that you care about. I was glad Steve mentioned the volleyball team because, you know, Maggie would get kind of stressed before volleyball games because she wanted to do well. She wanted to help her team, and she wanted to do what they ultimately did, which was go into a hostile environment at Princeton Day with a bunch of kids who were really kind of tools and jam it up their nose. Now, look at those faces, right? I came through stress. Right? They took a team that was undefeated in the regular season, that they'd lost to 4 times, and they won in 5 sets after being down 2-1, right? They rose to the occasion because they didn't think this is soul-crushing that we have to go to a 5th set. They thought, we're in this. We're pushing these guys. We're doing what we came here to do. Let's get after it. This is important to us. Focus now and do it. And that's what they did. But the message here is really, in addition to praising my daughter, the message here is really, don't try to eliminate stress from your life. You may do things to minimize your stress. I'm not saying that, but like recognize that stress will always be part of our lives. And what we're talking about now is when you get that stress response, how you talk to yourself, which then impacts how your body responds, and how you can then address that stress rather than folding under it. So not all stresses can be eliminated, right? There are stresses that are avoidable and stresses that aren't. But so in the earlier meeting, somebody said, how do you deal with stresses like faculty meetings, right? And drudgery of like faculty meetings. And I said, okay, so that may be a stress that you can alter or avoid, or it may be a stress that you have to accept and adapt to, right? So maybe you just don't go to the faculty meeting. Right? You avoid it. If it's not a useful meeting, maybe people start avoiding it. Maybe you engage with the person running that meeting and you talk to them about ways to improve the meeting so that you alter it so that the meeting is more productive. And lots of companies have spent lots of time trying to make their meetings more efficient and less sort of rote and routine. Maybe that's not possible and you have to accept that that period of your life is going to be done with that, or you can adapt your things to it. And a lot of the approaches I'm going to talk about from here on out are going to be on the adapt side. How we can change our own perception of what's going on in our own behaviors to better handle the stresses that are going to come to us that are unavoidable but will nonetheless happen at different times in our lives. So again, we're thinking about stress as an opportunity to rise to the occasion, right? And even with grades and exams, what I'll say to students is, think about this in the way that is like really designed to be beneficial to you. We're not just creating tests or exams to make a miserable moment for you where you feel like you can't hack it. What we're doing, if we're doing this well, is we're creating a moment for you to demonstrate to yourself and to me, the teacher, your mastery of a particular set of topics. And you're doing that to give yourself and me feedback so that I can then help you make sure you have these skills, because we, in our experience, have determined that these skills will be useful for you when you go on to the next step of whatever it is. And if you can think about an exam that way, then it's an opportunity for you to demonstrate to yourself how well you know this, so that you can take it and move forward. Now, most 15-year-old kids are like, pfft. But that doesn't mean I'm wrong, right? And it is a way to think about those things that are stressful, right, as we're going through this, that those are opportunities for us to rise to the occasion. So this is Kelly Mcgonigal. She's a Stanford researcher. She's written a book on this topic, and this is an excerpt from her TED Talk. See, it's a bad moment for that.
Can changing how you think about stress make you healthier? And here the science says yes. When you change your mind about stress, you can change your body's response to stress. Now, in a typical stress response, your heart rate goes up and your blood vessels constrict like this. And this is one of the reasons that chronic stress is sometimes associated with cardiovascular disease. It's not really healthy to be in this state all the time. But in the study, when participants viewed their stress response as helpful, their blood vessels stayed relaxed like this. Their heart was still pounding, but this is a much healthier cardiovascular profile. It actually looks a lot like what happens in moments of joy and courage. Over a lifetime of stressful experiences, this one biological change could be the difference between a stress-induced heart attack at age 50 and living well into your 90s. And this is really what the new science of stress reveals, that how you think about stress matters. The next time your heart is pounding from stress, you're going to remember this talk, and you're going to think to yourself, this is my body helping me rise to this challenge. And when you view stress in that way, your body believes you, and your stress response becomes healthier.
So a couple things. First of all, I love that vocabulary of your response to stress being the biology of courage, because it's hard to do, right? It's hard in that moment of stress to not let it overwhelm you. In fact, that's what it's designed to do. And so the courage is kind of standing up to that stress and saying, okay, I get the signal, but I'm not going to let this overwhelm my functioning. Right? I'm going to take a step back, I'm going to remind myself why this is valuable, and now I'm going to function. The second thing that I would say is that this is like any other skill. The more you do it, the easier it gets, but it's a process and you have to do it over and over and over and over again. Fortunately, there will be more and more things that provide stress, so you'll have those opportunities. The third thing is that when you do it in one arena, if you're thinking about it, it can be translated to other arenas. One of the reasons I'm thrilled that my daughter has had a positive experience in high school sports is that now when there's another acute event, like when she steps out on the stage wearing a fat suit in Hairspray, right? When you've had the experience of stepping out in that stage and delivering that song, the first time, you're a lot shakier. The second time, you really get really good at it. The third time, it's magnificent. And now next time when she's got a professional speaking engagement, she can channel both the volleyball and the theater and an exam and a paper and the things that you've done here for her to take that to the next level, right? So it doesn't have to all be the same thing. You can amalgamate these experiences from the different parts of your life and use them to remind yourself that you do have the capacity to do these things. But you do not have the ability to move the clicker forward. Okay. So one of Kelly Mcgonigal's colleagues at Stanford is a woman named Alia Crum. And Alia did a study to look at how stress mindset affects us physically and in the workplace. And what she did was she divided a group of people into 3 cohorts. The enhancing cohort got 3 15-minute videos. They watched each video once, and they watched the 3 videos over the course of a week. So 15 minutes basically every other day for a week was the entire intervention. The enhancing group got 3 videos that were stress as an opportunity to rise to the occasion, right? I can't wait for this big game. Pressure is a privilege. We get to go after this now. This is awesome. I've studied for this exam and I'm ready to go, right? The enhancing videos. The debilitating group, they got, oh my God, I can't believe it. This game is going to be difficult. I can't believe we have to do this. This exam is going to blow me away. This is horrible. The control group got to watch like Columbo or something. So what we see is exactly what we would want to see if our hypothesis is that your mindset about stress affects your outcomes. On the upper left, we see that the people who watched the enhancing videos actually had an uptick in the way they perceived stress. So they began to think stress more as a positive in the lines that we've been discussing. The debilitating videos, more soul-crushing, right? More negative, right? So only 15 minutes over 3 days, 1 intervention, and we see that change in how they perceive stress. So it doesn't take a lot for us to see a difference. In health symptoms, the people who viewed stress as a negative reported more health symptoms and they stayed static in the reporting, whereas the people who watched the enhancing videos reported fewer health symptoms and saw a material decrease in the health symptoms that they reported as a result of the fact that they were viewing stress more as a positive. And on both soft and hard metrics of work, so self-reported things and things reported by others, we see an increase in work performance from the people who are viewing stress as a positive. So we see tangible, evaluatable impacts from it. And the survey scale that they used is what you have in front of you right now. That's the sheet that I handed out, okay? So, oh, I should say one other thing about the Kelly Mcgonigal talk. if you have a negative mindset here, it doesn't mean you're going to die of a heart attack when you're 55, right? And it doesn't mean you're going to live until you're 90 if you have a positive outlook on stress. She's doing a TED Talk. Her job is in 17 minutes to give you one little thing that's going to change everything in the world, right? That's what TED Talks do. So keep that in mind, but it doesn't mean that she's wrong about the physiological responses and what that means, and in Alia's research. So if you guys have taken the test already, that's great. You can take a look at your scores. And in theory, so if you scored a 1 to 10, in general, what that means is that your innate way right now of thinking about stress is more on the soul-crushing side, right? Stress is unwelcome to you. It's a bummer. It's upsetting to you. It's negative, right? 11 to 20 puts you kind of in the middle range. And if you're going 7 slides at a time, 21 to 32 means you're already in that mindset where you're sort of thinking about stress as a positive, which is great, right? I personally, when I took this, was about a 13. And I guess what I would say is, again, this is all about looking at opportunities, right? If I'm in that 1 to 10, am I going to die when I'm 55? I mean, maybe. I don't know. I guess there are buses that might hit you too. There's a lot of reasons why that might happen. But what you can do is you can think about this now and think, okay, so what I should focus on now is it's going to be something that I'm going to need to focus a little bit more on. So when I was sitting over here in one of the seats that didn't win a prize this morning, one of Maggie's Spanish teachers came over and she reported that one of her students had, there was an exercise that they were doing and the student was like, oh, I really don't want to do that. That's my weakest strength. Right? And so maybe the negative mindset thing is kind of a weak strength for you. But the good news is this is a dynamic thing. This is not locked in place. You can move this from a 1 to 10 into that 21 to 32. It just means you're going to need a little bit more attentiveness, a little bit more repetition, a little bit more focus over a longer period of time to get yourself there. And so this is really a diagnostic, right? Not an outcome. So that's for you to think about moving forward. This is also publicly available if you wanted to like share it with family members or students or other things that might alienate you around the dinner table. Okay, so let's do a quick exercise. Let's spend about 5 minutes. Guys, pair up in groups of 2 or 3 and talk about activities in your day-to-day life that are kind of stressful or energy draining, and then have the people that you're talking to help you reframe them into a positive, and then switch roles. We'll spend about 5 minutes doing this, and then I'll ask a couple people for volunteers to talk about the story. So if you guys haven't, you should think about switching speakers. If you have, great. All right, let's wrap it up and come on back. And we're wrapping it up and we're coming on back. All right. Anybody want to share with our colleagues a story that a stress that we've positively reframed? Somebody needs to. It doesn't work otherwise.
We were talking about someone says they want to meet with you, and you even think, oh God, what I do wrong? And you think the worst, and you create all this anxiety about it before you know maybe what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I was saying, I'm trying harder to assume the best, assume it's going to be a positive thing. And even if it is negative, at least you came into it in a confident, positive place.
Yeah, so one of the things that happens, and we'll talk about this in actually, well, since I'm going 5 slides at a time, I'm not sure which of the next 5 slides it is. But we'll talk about that, the inner dialogue that happens. And the negativity bias that I referenced earlier applies here as well. When we don't know a scenario, that uncertainty is a threat, right? Now we don't know the outcomes. It's something we care about. We fill in the outcomes, but we have a negativity bias there too. So you kind of have to remind yourself, and so when I give this to like young attorneys, it's like, okay, the senior lawyer for whom you're working sends you an email that says, come see me, right? Almost exactly what you said. And it's like, oh shit, I'm gonna get fired, right? That's the immediate response. Oh my God, I blew a deadline, whatever, I gotta be ready. Oh my God, what am I gonna do? And it's like, the senior partner's like, oh, I wanna see John, come see me. Right? But that's not how it comes across, and you fill in that. So reminding yourself when you don't have information not to fill in a negative is a useful way to sort of positively reframe that situation. I think that's great.
That doesn't usually happen here. Like, the organizational psychology, we don't get called into someone's office to be like, we just want to talk to you, see how you're doing. And I think that's the hard thing, is like you have to ingrain that in the culture, right?
Yes, you do.
Because that's why the thinking trap is there. Because like organizationally, we're just like, people call me into the office because they have something wrong, not because something's right.
So yes, that's true. There are times when you get called into somebody's office and there's something that there's a problem and they need to talk to you about, right? And at that point, the good thing is they've brought you in to have an opportunity to discuss it with that person, in real time, voice to voice, and work through whatever that issue is. And presumably, they're not calling you in with malicious intent to make you feel miserable, but they're calling you in because you guys have a working relationship that they would like to enhance with you. Right? So I guess that's how I would positively reframe that, is this is an opportunity for me to sit down with that person and understand an area where the relationship doesn't seem to be optimal for both of us. And maybe that's because I've contributed something to it that in retrospect I wish I had contributed differently. And maybe it's because they're reacting to it differently than I intended them to. So in the last session, I described Maggie as a win then too, but I prefaced it by saying Maggie got in early to Tulane, which was her school of choice, and watching her grow and blossom was really valuable to me and all the skills that she has, and so thank you, Maggie's a win. And one of your colleagues came up to me and said that that comment had made them feel like they were, I'm blanking on the exact phrase, but basically that it had made her feel belittled because she felt that I had gone to a narrative of this is all about college placement. And that wasn't at all my intent. My intent was to say, not that I don't want Maggie to go to a good school, but that I wanted Maggie to go to a school that was right for her and that she had the tools to engineer, and I felt that she did that. But I conveyed it poorly, right? So she basically said, come see me. Now, fortunately, she did it in real time, so I didn't create the narrative. I was actually kind of surprised because I thought I had conveyed something different in what I put out there. But it's useful to get that, and it was an investment in me for her to do that. So that's the positive reframing there. I'm sure that a scientist, as opposed to a lawyer, would have a more precise response, or maybe not, because I play with words all the time, irrespective of what the data says. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. No, I guess for me, I'm not sure that there's an important practical distinction between the two. I haven't thought about parsing those two words out particularly, but when I'm anxious, it's about something, maybe this is it. Maybe anxiety has a little bit more of a future element to it, whereas stress has a more immediate present element to it. So I think they're very similar, and you have similar physiological reactions to the two. But as I'm thinking about it, I mean, honestly, I'm doing this in real time, as you can tell, so I'm not sure that that's right. But yeah. I'm afraid this is going to sound flippant, and I don't mean it to. I think that if you're not thinking about it, but it's having a reaction to you, then it's unconscious. And part of what the goal here is to make as much of it conscious as possible so that you're understanding how you're dealing with it and you're moving it into something that is useful as opposed to something that is subversive. So there's a lot to unpack there. But I think that what we're talking about doing is trying to develop mechanisms for dealing with the things that your body is telling you are threats to your environment that you need to focus on. Things that are important to you that you want to go a certain way and you need to focus on. Your body is telling you those things whether you know what they are or not. And there have certainly been times in my life when I'm like, why am I stressed right now? Right? And then what I do is I go through a list of the various things that I think could be wearing on me until my stomach goes like that. And I'm like, oh, let's dig a little deeper here. Right? There are Saturday mornings when I wake up and I'm like, I don't really have anything due right now. Why do I feel like I'm letting somebody down, right? And then I go through my list of things, and then I sometimes I'm like, oh shit, because I have that presentation on Thursday and I haven't put it all together. And sometimes I go, yeah, I think it's just because I'm used to doing things on Saturday mornings and I feel like I'm letting people down. I'm going to go have a cup of coffee and read the paper and tell myself not to worry about that. And if it pops back up, I'll do this again. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's, you know, but I guess I would say that if it's something that you've really sublimated because it's unsafe for you to deal with, that's something that to me suggests somebody with some professional experience to help you kind of carefully bring that out into the light and build the capacity to handle that. What I'm talking about here is not that -8 to -10 group. It's more of the day-to-day stuff that is going to be conscious. And I know that there are those things, but I'm not sure that, you know, putting a happy face on stress is necessarily going to deal with all of those things and that whole universe. There's a question over here? Did you just do this while we were talking, or did you just do this another time? Okay, so anxiety is something that you're producing without an external stimulus, whereas stress is something that an external stimulus has imposed upon you. So I guess for purposes of this conversation, then I kind of am going to stick to my guns and say I'm not sure that there's a real difference, because what I would say is the external stimulus and the internal stimulus are kind of the same reaction, which is I care about this, I want to pay attention to this, I want this to go a particular way, I'm going to try and do that. Yeah.
Just one more kind of a terminology question. So in your thing up here, you said list your top energy draining activities. Is that the same as saying list your top stressful activities?
So probably not exactly, but I think similarly. I mean, I think that things that are stressful tend to drain our energy when we're thinking about them as negatives, right? Whereas if you're able to phrase something as a positive and it's something that's enabling you to go somewhere, then you can draw some energy from that that helps you move forward. As an example, let's say that you love all your writing classes in college and you're totally not science. I don't know anybody like that. No idea what you're talking about right now, who then had to go take human biology and chemistry and society to solve distributional requirements in college, right? I hated those courses. They weren't at all what I wanted to study. I didn't think they were useful. I didn't think I was getting anything I needed out of them, but I had to go 3 times a week and sit there and listen to the droning, blah, 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 right? If I had stepped back and thought, actually, in 25 years, you're going to realize that studying for science classes gives you a completely different way to start thinking about problems and solving problems that you're going to wish you had paid attention to. And in the meantime, you're ticking off boxes that advance a really important goal for you, which is a college degree that's going to help you achieve things that you do want to do in life and increase your options for professional success. I would have approached those classes a lot differently. So chemistry was an energy draining activity for me because I wasn't positioning it as part of a larger picture of things that were important to me that I actually really wanted to do. And this was maybe not my favorite step, but nonetheless an important step in that process. And that's why I chose the words energy draining as opposed to stressful. Anybody got another story they want to share? One more and then we'll move on. I think that's great. And actually, you guys are pretty good because that was also in the last session. That precise scenario of like, got to get out the door, somebody just puked, stuck behind a school bus, all that other stuff. And that was the response was actually, what you're doing now is you're creating that atmosphere that's going to send you and them out into the day, and you're doing it together, and you're dealing with the craziness of life and then moving forward and out into it. And that's developing skills for your child as well, having them watch how you respond to it, that watch the juggling of now I've got to go to work, you've got to go to school, we all have these lives, and there are things that I'm doing that aren't necessarily where you're my top focus and where you're going to have to go do some things yourself, and so let's go do these things together, right? So I think that's a great one. Okay. So this kind of gets to the first one about what's our inner dialogue, right? I used to talk about this. This group will get this reference. I used to talk about this by ignoring your East German ice skating judge. But I find that I'm aging out of that talk. And so I've updated it to talk about your inner idol judge, because the negativity bias that we have when something goes wrong, we tend to listen to our inner Simon all the time. And what we need to realize is that inner Simon has a role, right? But also that inner Simon has a bias. We're biased towards inner Simon, right? Inner Simon has a loud voice that takes over the microphone and that draws everybody in. And it's hard for us to realize that inner Simon has a bias. And he's there to tell us all the negative stuff. Now, we could go all the way to the other side and we could go to inner Paula. Maybe that's productive, but probably we're going to realize that it's not all sunshine and light, and inner Paula is hopped up on some pretty powerful stuff, and she's talking crazy a lot of the time. Okay? So what I would suggest is try to find your inner Randy, right? Because your inner Randy is going to be like, yo, dog, wasn't my favorite song you've ever done. Might have questioned your song choice there, but you really went after it. I really appreciated your passion. I still think you're a great artist. You're finding yourself, and I'm going to look forward to seeing you here next week. Right? So that exercise of be an advocate for yourself a little bit and find that balance, right? Understand that you're going to go to the negative in your self-criticism. And another way that this exercise gets done is it's called the best friend reminder. Right? So if your best friend came to you with the very story you're telling yourself, so your best friend lays out all the facts that lead to your inner Simon response, how would you respond to your best friend? That's much more likely to be somewhere between Randy and Paula than it is to be your inner Simon. And if you can learn to be your own best friend in that scenario and think to yourself, what would I say to my best friend? What would Randy say? Then you're going to find that more balanced view, and you're going to give yourself more objective data to respond to, not just responding to the negative and filling it in with the negative, but something that's a little bit more balanced and a little bit more self-referential, right? So I know you guys have talked about PERMA and in the positive education. Something that I don't think is included in PERMA as importantly as I think it should be. I mean, there's an interesting irony about all of positive psychology, which is all of positive psychology is telling us that we're not good enough, right? We should be trying to live this utopian perfect life of eudaimonia and all that, and that means we're not there, and that means we're not perfect. So one of the things that I think is inherent in that is we need a part of PERMA that is self-forgiving. And I don't think that gets called out enough in PERMA, right? The victory is in the process. I am working towards it. That is what we're doing here, is we're working towards finding our inner Randy so that we can work towards someplace we want to go from here, because it's all journey. And so the victory is the intentional journey, not the perfectionist attainment. Okay, so keep that in mind when you're thinking about that, how you change your inner voice. Now, actually what scientists will tell you is the biggest thing you can do to ensure that you have the ability to positively reframe and manage stress is eat, sleep, exercise, repeat, okay? And in fact, one of the things that I have a lot of faculty members at the law school come to me and say is, what's my tsunami buoy for a student in crisis, right? I don't feel able to identify the students that are going into crisis, and I want to be able to catch them early and help them get the help they need. And my answer, which is not really my answer, it's the answer I've gotten from clinical professionals that I've gone and asked the same question to, is if you see somebody who is not doing these basic essentials, that's a sign of somebody in crisis, right? If they're not eating, if they're not sleeping on a regular basis, right? I'm not talking about the occasional all-nighter. That's going to happen in life. I'm not talking about missing a workout here and there, right? But people who aren't able to do these necessities on a reliable basis. And when you find the time and the discipline to do those things, they will have that broaden and build effect that gives you more cognitive energy, more physical energy, more ability to focus to get where you want to go. So when you're adapting and you're thinking about stress and what you can do, redirect some of your energy into this. When I was in my mid-30s, we moved to San Francisco. Probably the most stressful time of my life. We moved for an opportunity for my wife. I didn't have a job. Moving to San Francisco was like taking every price tag you've got and multiplying it by 15. We needed to buy a house. I didn't know where we were going to live. I didn't know where the kids were going to go to school. I didn't know anything. And I called my college roommate, and I was like, dude, I am so stressed out. I am boring myself. What am I going to do? And he said, shut up. Exercise 30 minutes a day strenuously. I got to go. And it really helped. It made a meaningful difference in my day-to-day existence just doing that one little step. I'm not saying that that's exactly what you guys should do all the time, but I'm using it as an example of how these three things, which you might not think about intentionally because they feel so basic, actually have an impact for people who are dealing with stressful situations. Now, it would be great if we all got 8 to 10 hours of sleep a night, wouldn't it? Okay, that's not realistic. I'm not putting that up here. Our students aren't doing that. We're not doing that. I'm recommending it, but I also understand how the world works. But what we can do is we can try to maximize the sleep that we get, okay? And that means screens. Screens emit blue light radiation. That blue light interferes with our body's ability to produce melatonin. Melatonin is the sleep hormone. If we don't have as much melatonin, we don't sleep as easily or as long or as well. And it's that as well part that's really the key. When you are asleep, it's a more fitful sleep. So do what you can do to avoid having screens on for an hour before you go to sleep. Do what you can do to maybe let's not talk about the humanitarian crisis at our southern border during the hour before we go to bed. Right? Yeah, go ahead.
Question, screens, does that include TV?
TV is not as bad as computers, but yeah, in general, you're much better off if you can read a story or listen to music or do something else, do the dishes, you know, something that you can find some sort of zen in. Well, I mean, so Jackson Browne, it turns out, is awesome dishwashing music. You can put Jackson Browne on, you can just get into a rhythm, you can do the dishes, and then you can go to bed, and you've got the satisfaction of a task completed, you got some Jackson Browne in, and you're calmer, and you've got more melatonin. Right? Everybody wins, including Jackson Browne. And then 5 minutes before bed, and this is something that really, without the MAP program, I would not have valued. I was not a guy who was spending a lot of time reflecting on things because there were so many things that I needed to do that I was always go, go, go. And MAP really enforced a regular reflection period that I found really, really surprisingly valuable. 5 minutes of quiet reflection. I know you guys know the 3 good things in the gratitude exercise. Maybe that's your version of this. I like to just sit there for 5 minutes and think about sort of the things what was important to me about the day and what do I need to think about briefly as far as how I'm going to plan out the next day. And just those 5 minutes of reflection right before bed, kind of, put your shoulders down a little bit, flex that out, and think about how the day went and things that you can do to move that forward before going to bed. Those are actually 2 really easy steps that will make the quality of your sleep improve. Yep.
I just have a sleep tip that I'm going to do studies on. I haven't done it yet, and I'm going to put my name down. A sleep mask makes a world of difference. And I think the thin, just pressure, and I'm looking for studies that show that, but I can tell you a bit.
When you're ready for the study, I'm in. Okay, so social media is a huge creator, artificial creator of stress. One of my favorite quotes comes from the great muse Rob Lowe. And Rob says, don't compare your insides to other people's outsides. Other people may have said it first, but I'm giving Rob Lowe credit. FOMO is the fear of missing out. I actually saw a t-shirt the other day that was JOMO. It was the joy of missing out. So hopefully that's becoming a thing, because that's awesome. But the idea is social media, like when I was in high school and was a dork and wasn't getting invited to parties, I didn't find out about it till Monday. Right? It wasn't like, oh, look at everybody at this party that they all told me they weren't going to, and look at how much fun they're having, and the relentlessness of it. So this was a study that some Penn researchers did of Penn students, and reducing their social media. So what they did was they took students and had them begin by reporting their levels of anxiety, depression, and loneliness. And then they had all those students reduce their social media on the big 4 applications to like a half-hour total per day. Okay? And what they saw, I don't have a laser here, but what they saw was for the kids who were already exhibiting low-level symptoms of loneliness and depression, we didn't really see a difference. But for the kids who had high levels of depressive symptoms, we saw a material decrease in those depressive symptoms simply by reducing their social media. right? Simply by limiting the amount of everybody else is having a better time, I'm the only one, I'm alone here in my room while the fraternity's happening and the sorority's happening and the teams are doing this and the clubs are doing that. Simply by taking that relentless pressure away and limiting it, we reduced depressive symptoms among students who were suffering from those. So one way to think about handling your stress is to reduce that comparative anxiety that happens. And so here, I'm using the word right? Comparative anxiety. I'm manufacturing this because of what I perceive to be the world outside, and that's a way for me to reduce that on my ecosystem. All right, so I put this slide up and every kid in law school goes, ugh, right? They don't want to be told about meditation. And that's when I say, no. I'm really bad at meditating, but mindfulness is broader than meditation. Meditation is a subset of mindfulness, and I want to talk a little bit about why mindfulness is valuable.
Mindfulness is the ability to know what's happening in your head at any given moment without getting carried away by it. Imagine how useful this could be. Just as an example, you're driving down the road and somebody cuts you off in traffic. How do you normally react? I think most of us, we normally react by having a thought, which is, I'm pissed. And then what happens next? You immediately, habitually, reflexively inhabit that thought. You actually become pissed. There's no buffer between the stimulus and your reaction. With just a little bit of mindfulness, in that same situation, you might notice my chest is buzzing, my ears are turning red, I'm having a starburst of self-righteous thoughts, I'm getting angry. But you don't necessarily have to act on it and chase that person down the road, screaming at them with your kids in the back of the car thinking you've gone nuts. Now, you might be thinking, don't I need to get angry sometimes? Aren't I justified? I would say yes, but probably not as much as you think. The proposition here is not that you should be rendered by mindfulness into some lifeless, non-judgmental blob. The proposition is that you should learn how to respond wisely to things that happen to you, rather than just reacting blindly. And that, my friends, is a superpower. How do you get it? The way to get it is through meditation. I believe that meditation and mindfulness are the next big public health revolution.
So the idea here is meditation, and when people describe it, they talk about the practice, right? My practice of meditation. Meditation and mindfulness is about the ability to direct your mind where you want it to go at any moment in time and be in control of that yourself. That's what we're talking about when we talk about mindfulness. We're talking about being conscious about your thoughts and your feelings and directing them in ways that you want them to go and that are productive. Meditation is a mechanism for that ability, and it is something that you have to practice because I suck at it, right? I immediately have all these thoughts bombarding me when I try to do it, and it's like whack-a-mole, and you really have to do it, except for me, the moles don't go down. So I just keep whacking at them, and they keep staying up there. And you really have to work at it. But the idea of conscious control of our minds and filling in those cognitive thinking traps and backing away from the response that we get when we get the stress response that narrows our cognitive focus, that's the key to this. And then the last thing is, this is, again, don't compare your insides to other people's outsides. So the kids in the seed class when I did this really appreciated this slide. Penn has something called pen face. Right? And pen face is that face you make when you're walking down the walk and you want everybody to know that you're crushing it at Penn when inside you are freaking the F out. Right? At Stanford, they call it duck syndrome. And duck syndrome is people only see the top half of the duck. They don't see the thrashing around that is going on underneath. Right? So it's the same thing, but each school has given it a different name. See, it ruins all my punchlines. Oh my God. Okay, so if this were on the slide, what you would see is that Stanford started a website called Places I've Cried. And it has over 1,000 members. Okay? Now, on the one hand, that's a bummer. But on the other hand, 1,000 people have shared the information that they're ducks. And that the top half and the bottom half are all the same duck. And all of the students at Stanford are ducks. Right? We're all feeling the same things. What our individual stressors are may be different, But we all have our stressors. We all have our things that make us thrash around. And we all have this view of the rest of the world exacerbated by social media that everybody else is handling it and I'm the only one who's not. And the sharing of this vulnerability or this vulnerability, which is Penn's wall of rejection, seriously? Sharing those vulnerabilities is what's really important, okay? So we're just about at the end. There is a takeaway slide here. Ta-da. And the takeaway slide says, look, stress is unavoidable. How we think about stress controls our physical response to stress and our ability to handle that stress. Little changes and little emphases on that make material differences. And there's one last thing that I would say, which is at the end of Kelly Mcgonigal's TED Talk, when she's talking about these hormones, she mentions cortisol. And cortisol is the stress hormone, right? It's the thing that people talk about as having long-term health consequences. But cortisol has a second function. It's a social hormone. And when cortisol is released into our bloodstream, we are impelled to go out and find other social interactions. And that makes sense too, because when we're not alone, we're safer. So when you're feeling stressed, think about these techniques. Remember that everybody else is feeling stresses similar to yours. And go find a colleague or a family member or a friend and share with them. You're investing in them. You let them invest in you. You will get a better response from your stress. You will be more able to cope with it. And you will build relationships throughout the building that will help you and the job that you do, for which, again, I am hugely appreciative. Thanks very much. My pleasure.
I'm Betsy Block.
Oh, hi, Betsy.
My son Davis is a senior as well.
Sure, wonderful, yeah. That's great.
I'm glad your year's going well.
Yeah, we've been really fortunate so far, and I think it's just been nice to see, because it hasn't all been sunshine and light, so we're nice to be in this particular area for now. I hope Davis is.
He's having a great year. Thank you.
Good.
Really, very good year.
Good.
But thank you for coming and sharing this
My
with
pleasure.
us.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
John,
Thank you so
Josie
much.
Burry,
Hi,
the
Josie.
Director
How are
of
you?
Development. Hi, how are you doing?
Good.
Good. I think my whole team was here.
Oh, good. Well, I hope they got something out of it.
Josh Perberry. I'm going to say thank you so much.
Thanks, I really
that
appreciate
was fantastic. I'd love you to talk to the rest of the parents, the students. Like, that was just awesome.
Oh, thank you. That's really nice. I'd be happy to.
I mean, it was just so good. And I feel like sometimes your scale resonated with me. I mean, I feel like sometimes we see a 1 and we're like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. We got to get them to an 8, and not realizing that maybe 2 is a fine place where most of us live.
Yeah, there's definitely, you're never firing on all cylinders, right? And there's always something where you're like, God, if only, and I think reminding yourself that it's okay to be in that space.
Absolutely. And that's what, I mean, that was just one of my big, huge takeaways from that. Where it's just like, it's not all going to be, sunshine and unicorns and lollipops.
And it doesn't mean you're failing.
Exactly. And that was just, I don't know, it hit, it was such a good, I sometimes am wary of like where we're heading with positive education. I feel like this is the ignored part up till right now that we haven't really like taken the bull by the horns and said, look, like stress can be a good thing. It doesn't mean like positive education doesn't mean stress goes away. It means we need to come up with healthy ways of dealing with.
Well, one of the things I said to your colleagues in the previous session was positive education does not mean incessant joy. These are tools that we're going to use to move ourselves along a process where we feel like our lives are more fulfilled. That's a very different thing than, positive education doesn't mean you're going to be happy in every interaction.
We had one, reading like last summer, and it was about parenthood, and it was essentially that parenting doesn't necessarily bring you great happiness, but it brings you great meaning and like a sense of purpose, and that's why we have kids, right?
Well, in fact, but there's an uptick in people's self-reported levels of happiness when their kids leave the home.
So I'm very appreciative of
Thank you.
sort of this take on everything we need to be thoughtful and mindful about. So
Good. Well, thanks for doing what you do.
Oh yeah, and I feel so bad that I haven't had like Maggie in class. Like I missed one. I missed a good one.
Well, I'm a fan for sure, but she's an acquired taste for others.